So let's ponder this question now. Joining me now is Betsy Woodruff-Swan, the politics reporter at the Daily Beast, MSNBC contributor, Matthew Continetti, founding editor of the Washington Free Beacon, and Eugene Robinson, Washington Post columnist and also an MSNBC contributor. Here's sort of what got me going on this idea that the Republican defense, while effective on the impeachment part, doesn't necessarily endorse presidential behavior. Look at this mash from the last 24 hours.
Are we having a hearing about inappropriate? Are we having an impeachment inquiry? It goes to the core of the fabric of democracy.
What I can tell you about the Trump policy toward the Ukraine, it was incoherent. It depends on who you talk to. They seem to be incapable of forming a quid pro quo.
I think this case is going to come down to the president's intent, his motive. Did he have a culpable state of mind?
Matthew, it does seem as if the best defense right now of the president isn't a great defense of his capabilities of being president.
Right. I think the general Republican defense is what was done was inappropriate, or feeling rather, among Republicans, what was done is inappropriate, but does not rise to the level of removing him in an election year. Now, as you point out, that only elevates the question of President Trump's behavior and conduct, which is a major vulnerability. Whenever we look at public opinion data, even among Republicans, there's some 52% of Republicans who wish that he would change his behavior. Right. So saying, yeah, it was bad, but doesn't necessarily help him in November.
Well, and Betsy, this gets to what the president has been quietly complaining about this strategy. He's not crazy about it. He's been, no, defend what I did.
That's exactly true.
This is a case where I think I get where his instinct, don't give him an inch, you give him an inch, and all of a sudden I'm the one on the island.
And that's why we've seen so many tweets and comments of him saying the call with Zelensky was perfect, when even his own National Security Council staffers have said the call was, could have been better. He really wants to see sort of aggressive intervention by his Republican allies. And part of the reason that Jim Jordan of Ohio was moved to the House Intelligence Committee specifically so he could participate in these moments is because he's one of the few Republican members of Congress who will really go all out to defend the president.
Even he didn't do that yesterday, Gene. He went into what, and I don't blame him. It's easier to mount the don't impeach him defense than it is the this was appropriate defense.
Right, because it wasn't appropriate. And so they can't credit.
Yes.
You cannot credibly say, number one, well, he didn't do it. It definitely looks like he did it, and you can't say that it was like a great way to do foreign policy, or you just can't say that stuff. So you can look. We're down to whether or not he had a corrupt mindset, whether he had corrupt intent, whether that was his intention. I would argue that when you use Rudy Giuliani and Lev Parnas and Igor Furman as your instruments of policy, we're halfway there to showing that corrupt intent. But that's not where Donald Trump wants his defense to be, but that's where it's going to be.
This is where, Matthew, it feels like, in the same way that Democrats didn't, I remember Democrats felt really good about the Benghazi hearings with Hillary Clinton. But over the long haul, did they do long-term damage to her? This could be a similar situation.
Right. Well, of course, we have to remember perceptions of President Trump are pretty much fixed, right? They're set in stone. And what's happened to the impeachment polling, it seems to me, is it's also becoming set in stone.
It's his job rating.
It's his job approval rating. It's split down the middle, basically.
Reverse job approval.
Slightly more want impeachment, but it's a tight rate. And I don't see anything coming from these hearings that is going to move Republican opinion in the pro-impeachment direction.
The huge piece of this that's going to take Republican messaging and blow up everything we've been seeing for the last couple of days is when Democrats have a nominee for 2020. Because right now, when Republicans only have Trump to talk about, and all they can discuss is how did these hearings go? What do you make of Bill Taylor and George Kent? It's tougher for them, even for the president's enthusiastic defenders. But look, as soon as Democrats nominate someone who Republicans can unify in their dislike for, it's likely that the party on the Hill will come together much more enthusiastically about going against a Democrat than supporting the president.
All right, let's talk about this Senate trial gambit. Again, I don't get the logic of why they think keeping Elizabeth Warren off the trail is a good idea.
I don't either, because if you think about it, if the nation's attention is focused on the Senate, the senators who are running for president are going to get plenty of airtime. They're going to be in plenty of demand. I mean,
True, but it won't be.
It's different.
It is, but Buttigieg and Biden will get Iowa to themselves.
Yes, right.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, no, that is a big deal. I just don't know if that really is a good way to go. You're really going to drag this out. You're really going to have this over a longer period rather than a shorter period. If you're the Republican Party, you're the Republican Senate.
And does a longer
want that.
Well, no, more importantly, does a longer trial help Trump? It may hurt the Democratic race, but does that help the president?
Well, I mean, there is the possibility that in a Senate trial, you might have witnesses like Hunter Biden
or something
called to the stand.
Okay, but that's a day or two. But my point is, dragging that out?
I agree that the incentives for both parties, I think, is to keep the trial short. And from the public statements of Mitch McConnell, at least, that seems to be his inclination as well.
There's also a lot of dissonance within Trump world about this particular question. There's not a consensus as to whether or not a long trial would be helpful. On the one hand, the impeachment proceedings have had the Trump campaign printing money from small dollar donors, and there's one school of thought that the longer this goes, the larger their cash influx is going to be. At the same time, even though there's no question, as the Post reported, that some Republican senators have been talking about the idea of having a long trial, I haven't seen or heard any indicators yet that McConnell himself is actually on board with this idea, and I think it's pretty unlikely in the long run that we see it look the way some of these Republican senators are talking.
All right, I want to narrow down a little bit and talk about yesterday and the interesting spin that I think, where I actually sense, Gene, that neither side's 100% confident what happened yesterday and how yesterday's going to play. And the reason I say that is this. Today you have the Democrats wanting to change the language. They don't want to use quid pro quo. You were in some ways were the you helped. You were
last week.
Yes, you wrote this last week, and here's Nancy Pelosi now. Now essentially using tougher words instead of quid pro quo, which of course has been something that we have seen an evolution on this really almost played out on air over the last couple of weeks. Let's see the MASH first, guys, and then end it with Nancy Pelosi.
When you're trying to persuade the American people of something that is really pretty simple, which is that the president acted criminally and extorted in the way a mob boss would extort somebody, a vulnerable foreign country, it's probably best not to use Latin words to explain it.
You can argue over semantics, but I think it's pretty easy by now to know that the president essentially used American foreign aid money to try to bribe Ukraine and doing things that really should not be done.
Congressman, I can't help but notice that in our entire conversation, I don't believe, unless I misheard you, that you used the phrase quid pro quo.
Well, using Latin per se is not something I tend to do, Hallie. This for that. You can call it whatever you want. It's all just words. The fact of the matter is he engaged in bribery or extortion, or if you like, quid pro quo. It doesn't matter what you call it. He did it.
The devastating testimony corroborated evidence of bribery uncovered in the inquiry, and that the president abused power and violated his oath by threatening to withhold military aid and a White House meeting in exchange for an investigation into his political rival, a clear attempt of the president to give himself the advantage in the 2020 election.
I know words matter, but do you think the difference between impeachment being at 60% and 53% is the Latin use of quid pro quo?
No, I don't, but I do think it's better not to use the Latin. I mean, I think simple, direct language is best in trying to deliver any message, and
Trump's proven that.
Well, exactly.
I mean that is something. In fact, he was mocked for it. Right, he was mocked for it, and it turned out, nope, make America great.
As you saw from the montage, I mean, the language had been moving away from the Latin for a while now. This is the first time that I'd heard Nancy Pelosi come out.
Well, that's why I used her at the end. It feels like she's putting, okay, guys,
so this is what it is now, right? And so does that make a difference? The difference between 53% and 60%? No, it doesn't. I just do remind everybody, though, we've had exactly 1 day of public hearings. Right. Right. So this is just kind of getting started.
Well, and not only that, Matthew, this brings me to, I want to do this excerpt because there's a rule in Washington when people use the word draw. So here was his in playbook about how Republicans vote. There are a few ways top-level lawmakers and aides in both parties are looking at the Republicans' performance. They dove headfirst down rabbit holes, regaling the crowd of millions of viewers with right-wing Twitter conspiracy theories. But they also did a decent job of muddying the waters, confusing the testimony and fighting the Democrats, quote, to a draw. According to Playbook, we heard the, quote, draw language from many Republicans on Wednesday night. Matthew, in my experience, if you're arguing that things were a draw, it usually means you don't think you won. You think you had a bad day.
There's some spin there involved. I do think the witnesses complicated the Democrats' approach, though, because both Kent and Taylor were very focused on process. It was all about which channels was this foreign policy being conducted through. And while there's legitimate questions and criticisms about what was going on with the Trump administration's shadow foreign policy, I think in the minds of voters, I don't think they're going to impeach somebody for trying to go around the national security bureaucracy and State Department. So I think that kind of got the Democrats' eye a little bit off the ball.
I think Matt's right. I don't think there's a lot of single issue proper usage of diplomatic channels voters. I think it's a fairly small community of people. And another challenge that Kent and Taylor presented for Democrats was that they didn't come out and call for impeachment. They focused very narrowly on talking about what they knew about and not getting ahead of their skis. And I think it's likely that that more witnesses who come in are going to follow the example that they set.
I actually thought that was a strength of their testimony. I thought they would have not been credible had they jumped into the political
We think he should be impeached, too.
We think he should be impeached.
But
no,
there were
that's
some
not
Democrats
their job.
who wanted to hear that. There were some Democrats who wanted to hear that.
Sure they did.
I don't think they should have wanted to hear that. I think it weakens the Democratic case if they're trying to build a case by portraying these people as being partisan.
Well, look, I think this is a case where the Democrats have this box. I understand why they want to keep it narrow. Keeping it narrow keeps it simple. Public does understand what happened. But keeping it narrow also makes it seem not as big. You broaden it, it seems more serious if you start including the other stuff, the Russia, the Syria. Then it's a different story, but then that's a harder case to make. Hello, YouTubers. If you're watching this, it means you've checked out our channel, so thank you. Now do me a favor, subscribe by clicking on that button down there. Click on any of the videos to watch the latest interviews and highlights from MTP Daily and MSNBC. You can get more Meet the Press content every morning in the First Read newsletter. If you're tired of content that you don't know anything about where it came from, you don't have to have that problem with us. NBC News, MSNBC, MTP, and the Meet the Press mindset right here for you on YouTube. Subscribe now.